Hello everyone, this is Shanko and welcome to chapter 11 of the Spring tutorial for beginners. So in the previous chapter, I talked about the Spring AOP module and we saw a demo for it. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the Spring Data modules, the Spring Data JPA module and the Spring ORM module, right? So for connecting to database from the application layer, oftentimes we need to write a lot of code that is usually boilerplate code to get our application layer connected to the database, the backend database. And apart from that, when we are trying to query the database, we have to write a hell lot of query to connect to the tables at the backend, to connect to the backend tables and fetch data from the tables, or to write to the database, write to the tables at the backend, or to manipulate the data that is already present inside the table, right? So Spring Data JPA and the Spring ORM module comes to our rescue, and it just helps us focus on the business logic, and it does most of the boilerplate code itself, and it provides implementation, or it provides a package which can be used to replace the boilerplate code, and we can just focus on the business logic without having to worry much about the boilerplate code to connect to a database or to connect to a backend from our application layer. So that is what Spring Data JPA or Spring Data module is all about. Now there can be multiple databases, or there can be different kinds of databases at our backend. So we can have relational databases such as Oracle database or a MySQL database, or we can have non-relational databases such as MongoDB or Cassandra, right? So Spring Data module provides support for all of these kind of databases, and most of these databases are covered by the Spring Data module, right? So for the demo, I've already created this project, and we have used this project in our previous chapters as well. REST API demo, we have used this in the chapter where we talked about the REST API where we talked about building a REST API in Spring using the Spring web framework, or using the Spring web module. And we also talked about this, or we have also seen this project in our previous chapter where we talked about the Spring AOP module, right? So first up, I'm going to open up the POM for this project and take a look at the dependencies for this project. So I'll go inside the dependencies tab, and we have Spring Boot Starter Web. So since we are trying to expose a REST API through this application or through this project, we'll be using Spring Boot Starter Web, and we have already seen these dependencies in some of our previous chapters, right? So Spring Boot Starter Web would make our application a web application. Then we have Spring Boot Dev Tools, so that would start up the server every time we make a save, or we change something and make a save, right? And then we have Spring Boot Starter Test, so that is for the testing module. Then we have Spring Boot Starter Actuator, so that would add some basic health metrics to our application. We have OJDBC, so that would help us connect to the Oracle database that we would be using as our backend. And then we have Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, so that would provide us support for the JPA layer, or for the persistence layer in our application, right? And Spring Boot AOP demo is some project that I had created in the previous chapter, and we would be using this for logging. We'll be using this to decouple the logging functionality of our project or our application into another application. So AOP demo, Spring AOP demo would be holding our code for the logging functionality of our project, right? So let's close this and take a look at the classes inside our project or inside our application. So first up, we have this user service application.java class, which is basically the entry point for our application, and it has this Spring Boot application annotation on top of it, which makes it a Spring Boot application, right? And apart from this, we have the controller. So this is the class which caters to the requests that come in to our application. So we'll be exposing our application as REST API endpoints, and these endpoints can be accessed by our consumers. And we have the controller annotation here for this class. So this makes this the controller annotation makes this class a controller class. And then we have the REST mapping here. So we have already taken a look at these annotations in our previous chapters, right? And we have REST mapping here, REST mapping annotation here, and inside this we have /API/v1 as our path, right? And then we have the service layer injected into the controller class, and we also have a validator layer injected into this class, right? And apart from that, we have these three methods inside our class, which are essentially some endpoints. So this is a post mapping, and this is used for saving a user into our database. And we have the type of data that can be consumed by this REST API endpoint, and the type of data that this REST API endpoint produces, right? So both are application JSON. And apart from that, we have another post mapping here. So this is used to fetch a user from the database. So we'll be sending in the username and password of the user as a post body request, and we'll be getting the user details, the complete user details. If it is a valid user, if the username and password are valid, else we'll be getting a response, no user found for the given credentials, right, as our response. And apart from that, we also have another endpoint which is called fetch, and then it takes in a username as a path parameter or a path variable, and this is a get mapping. So the method used for this for calling this REST API would be get, and it produces application JSON. So this endpoint is supposed to produce a data which is of application JSON type, right? And here this method takes in a variable which is of type string, and this is a path variable. So this username is a part of the URL that would be used to call this endpoint. So after fetch, we'll be sending in the username of the user which we are trying to fetch from the database, right? And if it is a valid user, if the password or if the user is found inside the database, we are sending in the details of we are giving out the details of the user, the complete details of the user. And if it is not a valid user, or if the username is not found in the database, then we send out a response saying no user found for the given username, right? So that is about the controller layer or the controller class. And next up, let's take a look at the user, or let's take a look at the service layer of our application. So this class user service is annotated with @service. So this makes this class, or this rather makes this class a service layer, and this is pretty much a component. And just to give an idea to the application developers that this class is supposed to act as a service layer, we have this annotation called service on top of this class, right? And inside the service class, we have a repository injected, which is essentially used to talk to the database and interact with the database and get data from the database, write to the database, modify existing records inside the database and stuff like that, right? So let's take a look at the repository layer or the DAO layer, DAO layer. So this is essentially our data access object layer or DAO layer, and this extends the JPA repository interface, right? So the JPA repository essentially provides support for the Spring Data JPA Spring Data JPA functionalities. So here we have two type parameters. The first one is the type of the entity or the type of the entity that we are trying to connect to, or the type of the entity basically that we're trying to connect to. And the next type parameter is the type of the primary key for this entity class, right? And inside this or on top of this we have @repository annotated. So this is again basically a component which acts as a repository, and just to give an idea to the application developers that this is supposed to act as the repository layer, we have this annotation @repository on top of it, right? And apart from that, we have two methods inside this interface, to abstract methods inside this interface. So the first one is find by username. So this method is basically called a query method, and an implementation for this is going to be provided by Spring at runtime, and we need not write a concrete class to provide an implementation for this interface and to provide an implementation for these abstract methods, right? So apart from this, we also have another method called get by username, and on top of this we have @query, and we can see we have some kind of query written inside it. So basically, to connect to a database or to talk to a database, we'll be needing queries, right? We'll be needing some kind of language that the database would understand and provide us with the details that we are trying to fetch or to write to the database and stuff like that. So for this method, we do not have any kind of query that we need to write, because Spring provides some default functionalities, or Spring provides implementations for some default queries, and we can make use of it. And without even writing a single line of query, we can just query the database. We can write to the database, we can fetch data from the database, we can modify the database or modify the tables inside the database without having to write a single line of query, right, using query methods. And apart from that, we can also have our custom query written. So that is exactly what I've done here. So using this @query annotation, we can have our custom queries written. So what we see here is basically not exactly an SQL query, or this is kind of similar to an SQL query, but this is not exactly an SQL query. So what we see here is basically a JPQL or a Java persistence query language, and we have something called select u from user. So this user is basically our entity class, which we would take a look at next. So the query goes something like select u from user q, where q.username equals :username. So this is a parameterized query, and we are trying to replace the value of username with this parameter that this method receives, right? And we have this annotation @param to specify that we are trying to use this username as a parameter in our query, right? And now let's take a look at the model class or the entity class. So this is basically our entity class, which is named as user, and on top of this class we have this entity annotation present. So this marks this class as an entity class. We also have this annotation @table present here, and inside this we have profile user. So the backend table that we have here is profile user, right? If we do a select start from profile user, so right now we don't have anything inside our database or inside a table in the database, and we can see we have these 4 columns in our table. So we have username, password, first name, and last name inside our table as columns. So using this @table, what we are telling Spring is we are telling that this class user is supposed to be mapped to this backend table called profile user, and that is exactly the name that we have mentioned here inside the table annotation, right? And inside this class we have some attributes called username, password, first name, and last name. So these are basically the columns that we see inside the table in our backend, right? And on top of this attribute username, we have this @ID. So this is supposed to be the primary key for our table or for our entity. And we also have a column mapping here using @column annotation, and we are saying that this attribute is supposed to be mapped to a column named username, which is present inside our profile user table, right? And we also have provided a constraint. So we are saying that this field or this attribute cannot be null, right? And similarly for password, we have it mapped to a column which is called password inside our table profile user, and this field also cannot be null. And then we have an attribute called first name, which is mapped to a table column called first name, and then we have this attribute last name, which is mapped to last name, right? So that is basically our entity class. That is basically all about our entity class, right? And apart from this, let's take a look at the application.properties inside our src main resources folder. So we have the application name here, and the application is supposed to be running on 8283, and we have the data source configuration here provided. So we have the username, password for connecting to the database or the data source, and we have the URL, we have the driver class name, right? And apart from that, we have some Hibernate configuration here. So we have specified the database platform here, right? So that is all about the code inside our application. Now let's try to run this and see how it works. So right now inside our database we don't have any records, right? We don't have any records, and we try to create a user inside our database. So we'll go to Postman and say, so let's take a look at our controller class, and let's take a look at the endpoint that is used to save a database, or that is used to save a user in our database. So we have this endpoint called save, right? So we need to call this endpoint from our Postman application, right? So let's go to Postman, and this is also a post method because we have the post mapping annotation on top of this class, right? Or on top of this method. So here I would be saying /API/v1/save, right? And for the username, I'd be saying, so we need to pass a valid user to save into the database, right? So I would be saying test1, so I would be saying test1, and we'd have the password as password pass1, and first name as test_first, and last name as test_last, right? And I would click on send. So we have this response 201 created, right? And we have the message here which says user has been successfully registered. Now let's go to our database and take a look at the table and see if the user has gone created or not. So we have the user inserted in our database, right? Username, password, first name and last name. Right now let's try to fetch our user. So what I'm going to say is fetch fetch, sorry, fetch fetch, and this is going to be a get mapping, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to call this endpoint. So we have fetch and username, and this is essentially a get request or a get mapping. So the method here would be get, and let's just copy the username from here. So that is test1, and I would paste it here, right? And I would click on send. So we have a 200 response, and we can see we have the data here that we have in our database being fetched by our application, right? So what is essentially happening is this method is getting called, this get mapping is getting invoked, and this in turn is calling the service layer, right? User service.get by username, and it is passing in the username as a parameter. So we have this username test1 that is being passed as a parameter to this method, and this in turn is passing the username to the service layer. And inside this service layer we have this find user by username, which takes in the username as a parameter, and this in turn is calling the repository or the DAO layer, right? And inside the DAO layer we have this method get by username, and this too takes in the username as a parameter. And on top of this we have a custom query written, right? Select you from user. So that is essentially the user class or the entity class that we have created, that we have mentioned here. So this is a JPQL that we have written here, a custom JPQL or a custom query that we have written here, and that is what is being used, right? And what we are saying here is where u.username is equals to the username that is being passed as a parameter, right? So let's try to pass an incorrect username or path, or a username that is not present inside the database, and let's see what happens. So we have a successful we have a 200 success being returned by our API, and we have this data here, right? No user found for the given username. So this username is not present inside the database. So that is all about this chapter, and that is how we can use Spring Data JPA to connect to a backend table or to connect to a backend database from our application layer. And here we used a relational database, but there's support for non-relational databases as well in Spring Data module, and it helps us reduce the boilerplate code, and we can focus writing the business logic instead of having to worry about the boilerplate code. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy, please give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching.